everyone. Welcome to week 1 of our 6-week series on creating relationships you love. Today we are going to be talking about managing expectations, and I want to talk for a minute about why this is important and why I chose to start with this specific lesson. So I remember a time many years ago when I was going through a very frustrating experience, and I was talking to my brother about I had all these big emotions that were coming up. And he said something to me that I had never really thought about in these terms before. And he said, Robin, your disappointment is a function of your expectation versus reality. A very simple observation that may seem obvious to many people. Maybe to you that seems very obvious. But to me, it was really important to hear him say that because I really had never quite thought about it in those terms. And it was really helpful for me to identify specifically that my expectation was really the only thing that I had control over. So the specific example that I am referring to at the time had to do with my education and the education program that I was going through. Those factors were completely out of my control, right? That reality, quote unquote, was completely out of my control. And so I was beating my head against this mountain, fighting against a reality that I could not control. However, my expectation and the emotion that was coming up for me as a result of that expectation, as it compares to the reality, that was within my control to manage. I could manage my expectations and the way that I approached that entire situation, the entire relationship. Those components were in my control. And so often, one of the things that I notice is that whenever we are experiencing suffering or disappointment or frustration or resentment in our relationships or in our lives, whenever I sit down with people and really dig into those circumstances, those situations, so often the source of that pain and that suffering and that conflict within their relationship, one of the common denominators that I find, and we're going to talk about this all throughout this 6-week series, one of the common denominators is that we are focusing more on our circle of concern, as Stephen R. Covey would refer to it, over or rather than our circle of influence. He calls it circle of concern versus circle of influence. Another way to think about this is things we can control and things we can't control. And so often, what we do is we try to exert control over our circumstances, over our reality. We try to exert control over our situation, over other people. We try to manipulate circumstances, outcomes, results, behavior. We try to control and manipulate other people in order to solve for our own disappointment, anger, frustration, feelings of rejection, envy, jealousy, whatever it might be. And so we're having this thought, if they would just change, then I could be okay. If the situation was just different, then I could be okay. If he would just empty the dishwasher, none of this would be happening. And so we're focusing outwardly on all these other things that are not within our control, and that's where we put our energy, right? So one of the common denominators that you're going to see come up over and over again is kind of focusing on these areas that we can control. What do we have control over? And don't get it twisted. I love the idea of being able to control the world and control other people. Gosh, if we could do it, if that worked, I would be all in, my friends. All in. I love that idea. However, I just want to submit to you that I have tried it, and it is exhausting. It's one of the largest components of emotional exhaustion and burnout that I find over and over again is people trying to control the world, people trying to control other people. So I want to invite you as we kick off this 6-week series to take a breath and consider releasing that control. And I'm going to show you several tools for controlling and managing what is within our area of influence, what is within our area of concern, or rather influence and control. And I'm going to show you what we can do and invites you to release the things that you can't control. And so I want to say that it's not that having expectations is bad. There's nothing wrong with having expectations. In fact, I think it's important to understand what our expectations are and to communicate them effectively. The problem is that, first of all, we have so many expectations that we're not even aware of. So many expectations that we come into our marriages with, into our relationships with, into our parenting experiences with. When we become a manager or an employee at a new organization, we walk into those new jobs, those new roles, those new relationships with all kinds of expectations that we're not even aware that we have. Right? And so I grew up watching my mom, right, and my parents and their marriage and their relationship, and my brothers and sisters, the way she parented my brothers and sisters and myself, right, the way other kids in my church and in my school, the way they were parented, all of this community, everything. It's like a fish in water, right? And you're just you're so not even aware of it. But every one of those experiences created thoughts and belief systems and observations and expectations. And until you're challenged or in a situation, oftentimes we're not even aware of it. But yet it's like we have this disappointment or this frustration or this thought like, well, that's not how that's supposed to be done. It should be this way or it should be that way. You're supposed to remember our anniversary. You're supposed to remember my birthday. You're supposed to buy me flowers if you love me. That's what my mom, my dad always did for my mom, or my mom always did for her partner, right? And so we have these expectations for the way that we think things should operate. And oftentimes we're either not aware of them, or the ones that we are aware of, we often communicate them from a place of frustration or just not very effectively. And the third thing I want to say is that when those expectations, say we do communicate them, say we even communicate them well, not from a place of frustration or anger, but simply a very respectful ask, right? Hey, I'm having this expectation of the way that we parent our child, or I'm having this expectation that you clean up the kitchen after you are finished making your lunch, and would you be willing to do that for me? Say you communicate your expectation calmly, respectfully, and the partner, in this case, we're talking about a partner, say your partner does not follow through on that expectation and they disappoint you. This is the last problem that I want to talk about, is that even if we do communicate our expectations, we are not often very highly skilled at regulating our own emotions when those expectations are not met. And so one of the key components of this first course that I want to teach you is the idea, again, that we can't control other people, that they are adults, and they get to behave however they want to behave. We are not here to control other people. We can make a request, but if that request is denied, at that point, their behavior is it is not in your circle of control. And so we are not going to spend our time or energy trying to control their behavior. And so what I want to teach you to do is how to control and regulate your own emotions when those expectations are not met. And so if you're a part of a VIP coaching package with me, you can set up, your coaching calls, and we can go through that one-on-one. And that's something that's a really key component of my coaching packages, is really teaching people, what do you do when someone's not following through on a request? What do you do when someone's not meeting your expectations? And there's some behavior we're going to talk about preferences versus boundaries next week. So there are some behaviors that are not okay that I will not be a part of, right? I'm not going to put myself in a situation like, for example, in an abusive situation. There are some things that I call boundaries, and I can't control that behavior, and I recognize that. And so I have to decide what is a boundary violation and what is an unmet expectation that I can manage my own emotions around. And if it's a boundary violation, I may leave the relationship, I may leave the house, there's all kinds of things that we can come up with around that. But I just wanted to say that I am saying you can't control another person's behavior. That doesn't mean you have to put up with it. And so you get to decide what your response is going to be. And so we're going to talk more about that next week also. So, unmet expectations. This is the foundation where all of this disappointment, frustration, anger, resentment, all of these things rest on that foundation of unmet expectations in a relationship. And when you look at relationship conflict, when you look at fights, when you look at frustration, all the things that you have, you can probably identify some of these emotions, right? What is it that keeps coming up for you? And this is the step one that we're going to talk about, is identifying those feelings. My professor should be sober, right? That was an expectation I had. I spent all this money on a program and I got a drunk lab instructor. I was furious, right? What was the expectation? The expectation that was my professor, my teacher should be sober if I'm paying for this class. And that didn't match up with reality, and so I was angry. Another expectation, children should respect their parents. I believe that children should respect their parents. That's an expectation that I have. When the 4-year-old is throwing a tantrum, disrespecting toys or property or saying rude things to his or her parents, what emotion does that bring up in me? Anger, frustration, feeling disrespected, right? Whatever it might be, but there's a negative emotion that happens. Why? Because there's an expectation in my brain that children should respect their parents, and he's not or she's not. Therefore, I have a negative emotion because that expectation is not meeting with reality. So I have to go in and manage that expectation. And that doesn't mean that I just say that the behavior is okay. That's not the same thing. And we're going to talk about that more. But just recognizing the expectation is important. My husband should not leave dirty dishes in the sink for me to clean up. My wife should remember our anniversary. She should do this. He should do this. He should not smoke. He should not be an alcoholic. Right? All the expectations. Spoken or unspoken, when expectations oppose reality, it creates a negative emotion. So these are important to recognize because it's the negative emotions that are actually impacting your relationship in negative ways. It's not actually the behavior. And if you watch the videos on the model, you'll see that the circumstances, the behavior, drunk husband, drunk wife, that behavior or circumstance is not actually what's creating negative emotion. It's the thought you have about it, the expectation you have about it, that they should not be drunk. Can you understand that? Can you see that? There are some people who maybe don't care if their partner's drunk. Same circumstance, different expectation. I'll get drunk with you, right? And so it's the filter that you interpret that through. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't draw a boundary around it. And you might say, I'm not going to be in the house when you are drunk. That might be a boundary that you decide to draw. But you're not managing that person's behavior or trying to control them. They get to be who they are. You are managing you. Okay, so the goal of this first session, this first week, is to learn how to engage our expectations properly, how to understand and engage our expectations. So we're going to learn how to identify them. We're going to learn how to communicate them effectively. So what are my expectations? Are there some that are rumbling around and they're creating discourse or disharmony that I'm not aware of? Am I communicating them effectively? And then we're also going to learn how, with intention, how do I show up when my expectations are not met? Especially if I've communicated them. That can be frustrating. I've said it 50 times. I'm so angry. They're just not listening. This is common in relationships. And so we're going to learn, how do we show up when our expectations are not being met? What do we do? The thing too that I want to say is that it can be difficult. Okay, this takes practice. It can be difficult to show up from a place of love when you feel like your deepest core values are being disrespected. So I want to take a minute to honor that. This is not easy work, right? This is very human for us to feel angry when we are interpreting a behavior as disrespectful, especially if it's continuing to happen, right? This is normal. To feel disrespected, to feel angry. It can be difficult to communicate from a place of love and calm, compassionate communication when we're feeling flooded with difficult emotions. This is a skill that we learn, that we practice over time, so be patient with yourself, okay? However, I want to say that it is possible. It is possible to release that control, trying to control another person. We don't have to approach our relationships that way. There is another way. There is a way to respond from a place of love. regardless of what the behavior is of the other person. What does it look like to respond from a place of love? And we can respond by holding healthy boundaries instead of holding on to resentment. Doesn't that sound so much better? When my husband or my wife or my partner, when they refuse to help around the house, to help with the kids, when they refuse to meet my expectations, my simple standards that I'm asking for, that to me feel like respect, love, trust, whatever the value is, there's values underneath all of this, right? And so when it feels like those are being disrespected, it feels like you have to be angry, you have to be resentful. That's what self-respect means. But I want to submit to you that there's another way. Someone can have a negative behavior that you don't like, and you can say, I don't prefer that behavior in my life. This is what I'm going to do about it. And so you can draw a boundary. You can totally respond with love and still not put up with something. And it doesn't have to become a fight that destroys your relationship. There's another way of having these difficult conversations and standing up for yourself from a place of love and self-respect, and still being compassionate and loving to another person, even when they're being difficult. So that's something that's really powerful to consider, and that's ultimately the work that we're going to do. So if you guys have the one-on-one coaching packages, just know that we're going to talk about that even deeper. But for today, let's dive into the exercises that we have around managing expectations, okay?